We are grateful for the gifts that you share with this community, both those for helping our children to have a wonderful playtime when they're here, and also for everything that maintains this beautiful property that we have. We have a responsive reading, a second responsive reading. It is number 461 in the back of the gray hymnal. The words also appear on the monitor. These are the words of the great Protestant theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. We must be saved. Again, I will read the type that is irregular, and you will respond with the italicized words. Nothing worth doing is completed in our lifetime. Therefore, we are saved by hope. Nothing true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we are saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we are saved by love. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as from our own. Therefore, we are saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness. Lashana Tova. Happy New Year, everyone. We are midway through the 10 days in the Jewish calendar known as the High Holy Days, the Days of Awe. It begins with Rosh Hashanah, the celebration of the beginning of the new year, and ends with the holiest of all days, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Jews who identify as religious or secular cultural Jews, whether observant or non-observant, take the message of Yom Kippur very seriously. Rosh Hashanah, or the Book of Life, is opened, and the fates of Jewish people during the coming year are written into the Book of Life. Then Yahweh closes the book on the Day of Atonement until another trip around the sun is completed. During the intervening days, Jews are expected to seek forgiveness from those whom they have wronged. As Jewish UU minister Liz Lerner-McClay summarizes in her essay, The Discipline of Forgiveness, which is published in Jewish Voices in Unitarian Universalism, perhaps the most important point, according to the Jewish system, is that the onus to invoke forgiveness is on the wrongdoer, not the wronged. The steps are non-negotiable. The person who has been hurt can just stay hurt. It's up to the person who did the injury to own up, admit what they did, apologize, and ask for forgiveness. Offer to make it up to the injured person, however they can, however the injured person chooses. Here's the crucial part, she says. The wrongdoer must take all these steps with the actual person they hurt. In Judaism, no absolution can take place unless the admission and atonement happens with the person who suffered the wrong. And here's another kicker. We're not off the hook unless the person we've wronged says we are. Think of that story that Melinda shared of Harriet in the garden. I think she took all the right steps. But this is not the end of the process. Jewish tradition takes the expectations for a path to reconciliation even further. If the two parties cannot find a way to reparations and reconciliation after 3 attempts, the rabbi can be brought in as a mediator. The onus is on the wrongdoer, but there is pressure on the wronged to eventually forgive. The consequences are immediate in the sense that the wrongdoer's name is not written in the book of life for another year. Therefore, their fate is not sealed into a positive outcome. It is uncertain. The role of the Book of Life in this, I believe, points to aspects of our universalist theology. Before I elaborate on that, I think it's important for us to explore several worldviews about sin. This will obviously not be an extensive examination, but rather an oversimplified comparison of basic understanding. A good starting place is with etymology, the root meanings of words. The Latin word roots for sin focus on a question of guilt and that the charge has been proven, whereas in Greek, the language of early Christian scriptures, sin is understood to mean missing the mark or missing the target. In Eastern philosophical traditions such as Hinduism and Buddhism, sin is related to karma in the sense that sins are actions that create negative consequences, or karma. There is no ideal way of grouping world religions and philosophies since they're part of the cross-pollination of human history. So I'll explore the most familiar faith traditions that include concepts of karma first: Hinduism, Buddhism, and neo-paganism. So again, in Hinduism, sins are actions that create negative karma, where karma is understood as the combination of actions and their consequences. Sins violate moral and ethical codes. A sin is an act against the Dharma, the moral order, and against oneself. Sin, which can also be unknowing or unintentional, brings negative consequences. Now, while Buddhism shares analogous ideas of karma and demerit with Hinduism, it has no concept of sin per se. In Buddhism, which does not have a pantheon of gods and goddesses, the focus is on the root causes of suffering. Good deeds produce good results, and bad deeds produce bad results. Lessening and elimination of suffering, or the maximization of good karma, is accomplished by aligning with the Dharma through positive action, right relationships, and compassionate, loving human kindness. Neo-paganism has incorporated karmic ideas, and some espouse the threefold law, which suggests that the consequences of one's actions are returned to them threefold. This is by no means a universal doctrine in neo-paganism. The second set of faith traditions that I want to consider this morning are monotheistic religions from which Unitarian Universalism draws inspiration. The Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, plus the Baha'i faith, with which we have some close affinities. I will describe these in chronological order. One characteristic that all four share is the concept of free will. Human beings have the ability to make choices about their actions. In Judaism, sin is a violation of the divine commandments of Yahweh. There are three kinds of transgressions. Those that are intentional are deliberate defiance of God's laws, as recorded in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures, the written law of Judaism, literally instruction or teaching. A second type of transgression is done knowingly, intentionally, but not to defy Yahweh. There are times when a Jew has to choose between an action that breaks a commandment and an inaction that breaks a commandment, possibly the same one. An example of this is Jewish interpretation of abortion, where aborting the fetus breaks the commandment against taking a life, but by doing so, the life of the mother is ensured. The third type of transgression is unintentional, a sin that happens through accidental circumstances. Christianity makes more of sin being an inherent part of humanity's makeup, that notion of original sin against which universalism sought reform in the late 18th century. The way I understand it, the Christian concept of sin is intimately tied to the Greek and Latin etymology for the word. Clearly, the Greek, to miss the mark or target, is the sense embedded into the so-called New Testament as written in the Koine Greek translations, whereas the understanding of sin as guilt informs the Latin Vulgate translation upon which the Catholic Church depends for its interpretation of Christian scriptures. Either way, sin is about the relational consequences between the sinner and God, sinner and other people, and sinner with oneself. I read a really interesting historical novel by a Japanese author, Susaku Endo, this summer. Published in 1969, Silence explores the relationship between Portuguese Catholic missionary priests, Japanese peasant converts to Catholicism, and the powerful Japanese ruling elite. Among other threads in this fascinating piece of literature, Endo explores the concept of sin, which he defines this way. Sin is for one person to walk brutally over the life of another and to be quite oblivious of the wounds they have left behind. The Portuguese priest, reflecting on what it means to sin, comes to see sin as an act rather than a state of being. It is not original to our humanity. Likewise, Islam views sin as an act, not a state of being. Muslims say that sins are actions that go against the will of Allah. There are several types of sin found in the Quran, and these are in increasing order of magnitude: mistakes, immorality, transgressions, wickedness and depravity, and the greatest of all, ascribing a partner to Allah, or in other words, saying that there is another being or essence of equivalent power or stature to Allah. For Muslims, there is no God but God. Unlike the Jewish tradition, where the focus of rectifying the sin is on the immediate relationship between the wrongdoer and the wronged person, the Baha'i believe that sin is a matter that should be addressed between the sinner and God alone. One would not confess a sin to anyone other than God. Baha'i hold that human beings are naturally good. As mirrors of the love of God, humans reflect God's inherent goodness and mercy. Therefore, sin amounts to turning away from that which is good or following one's own inner nature. It is a self-serving inclination. I alluded earlier to how Universalists found the doctrine of original sin, the belief that humans are inherently depraved and unacceptable. This was a reaction to the Calvinist doctrine of double predestination, wherein not only are all human beings born in and of sin, but that only some are chosen prior to birth to ascend to heaven after their death. Despite being encouraged to earn one's way into heaven through good deeds, the decision had already been determined. One was damned if they did good works and damned if they didn't. In response, Universalism says that God is a God of love, and universal love at that. Humans are inherently good. God loves us all, and we are all capable of reaching heaven. Over time, the Universalist concept of heaven shifted from an otherworldly place to right here on earth in our lifetimes. We make our own heaven or hell through our actions. Sins, then, are the life-denying behaviors we engage in that result in compromised relationships with self, with others, with the planet on which we depend for our life and breath, and with that which is ultimate, but by whatever name you call it, and which some of us call the spirit of life. Unitarian Universalist understandings of sin and forgiveness developed out of religious reform movements that were intent on returning their interpretation of the Bible to a closer reading of the original texts, stripping away centuries of translations and doctrinal teachings. This resulted in a greater alignment with Jewish teachings than Catholic ones. Unitarian Universalism is a living tradition. We believe that revelation is not sealed, and a healthy faith is an evolving faith. During our roughly 200 years as a uniquely American faith tradition, we have allowed ourselves to learn from and be inspired by not only our direct ancestry in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but we also look to reason and science, other world religions, and earth-centered traditions as sources of inspiration for our faith. Not to be confused with acts of justice, forgiveness is a spiritual practice that calls for love and a new heart that is found in most of the world's faith traditions. In Hinduism, forgiveness is multi-layered and multifaceted. There are two sides: the person seeking forgiveness and the person with the power to extend forgiveness. From either side, the process can be done in the presence of the other or not. Unconditional, unbound love is necessary for healing to take place. The Buddhist spiritual practices of compassion and nonviolence are extensions of this approach to forgiveness. For Christians, the Lord's Prayer is a devotional practice that commits to forgiving it of self as well as others for trespasses, as Jesus is said to have prayed while on the cross. In Islam, forgiveness is the preferred course of action and a prerequisite for genuine peace, the ultimate goal in a Muslim's life. You don't have to consider yourself religious to engage in the practice of forgiveness. Scientific studies of forgiveness are plentiful. The mental and physical health benefits of forgiveness are touted in numerous articles and studies on medical websites, in the popular press, and in academic journals. It takes a person of moral strength and integrity to forgive, but it leads to reduced levels of stress and all of the impacts that that has on our physical health. And it also leads to greater levels of self-esteem. So let's return again to the Jewish prescription of actively and proactively righting the wrongs caused by our sins, the transgressions in our lives. It's not about burning later in hell. The threat is much more immediate. You put your life here and now in jeopardy when you walk around with unforgiven wrongs attached to you. So we have to do our best to win forgiveness. But also the wronged person needs to try to rise to the occasion and forgive us when so much depends on forgiveness, says Liz Lerner McClay. She adds that this is a theological system of right relations. In the words of Chaim Stern, it allows us to access a new heart and a new spirit. Furthermore, as McClay puts it, the accountability, relational nature, and intentionality of the Jewish system of forgiveness make it profoundly relevant for any people in any time. For Unitarian Universalists, it means leaning more deeply into the 7 principles, especially the first, every being is important, the second, treat people kindly and fairly, and the 7th, caring for the earth, our home. Paula Cole Jones is an African-American UU who conducts diversity trainings. She wrote about practicing reconciliation as a personal spiritual discipline in a March 2004 issue of the UU World. You can find it online. She quotes Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu, who said, "Forgiveness is giving up the idea that the past could have been different." Reconciling her own past helped Paula Cole Jones to facilitate healing after a crisis in the racially diverse UU congregation to which she belonged. Her 13-year-old message that Unitarian Universalists have a special need for reconciliation based on our mixed record in anti-racism, anti-oppression work is still relevant today. Things are not all right now, and they have not been all right in our past. Forgiveness and reconciliation do not change history, but they do transform the present moment as well as the future of our relationships to paraphrase Paula Cole Jones. Again, quoting Bishop Tutu, without reconciliation, there is no future together. A companion article in that 2004 issue of the UU World provides an outline of the practice of reconciliation. It notes, apology alone is not enough to achieve reconciliation. In fact, it may do more to relieve the burden of the person who caused the injury than it does for the injured party. Apology followed by forgiveness can be an act of generosity, but still may not complete the work of establishing a sense of trust. Reconciliation, the dictionary definition, is to restore friendship or harmony, or to settle or resolve differences, transforms both parties by bringing them to a new consciousness about the way they see, treat, and represent each other. Reconciliation is a competency that takes work to develop, and it requires commitment. The practices of atonement and reconciliation are about turning leaves, pages in the books of our lives, being saved by hope, faith, love, and forgiveness, that we may receive new hearts in the process of transforming our relationships with self, others, the planet, and the spirit of life. Having turned the leaves of sin into forgiveness and reconciliation, we can sing praises for all that is our life.